Should I introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Rob Crosnoe. I'm the chair of the Department of Sociology here at the University of Texas, and I'm going to talk about research that I've conducted on adolescent drinking. So I'm a sociologist, and sociologists are less interested in what people do than in what they do means, right? So as a sociologist who studies adolescent development, my driving question is not so much how are adolescents behaving as opposed to like why are they behaving the way that they do. So we can consider drinking. Most of the updated national statistics tell us that the overwhelming majority of adolescents will drink by the time that they finish high school. But only about a quarter of them have been drunk recently. So they drink, but they don't really drink that much. And so in that way, they're a lot like adults. Most adults assume the status of drinker at some point in their lives. But their actual engagement in drinking fluctuates pretty widely as they move through life and they experience different things. And that's usually explained as this varying balance between the opportunities to drink and the constraints on drinking. So within all of these fluctuating national statistics, you have living, breathing teenagers. And there are many of them whose behavior is driven by addiction, but for most of them, it's an almost hyper-rational calculus about the risks and rewards of engaging in this behavior, right? So they might think that they are getting something from drinking, even as they're giving something up for drinking. So I'm going to talk about my research on relatively moderate levels of drinking. So drinking that goes up and down within a fairly moderate bandwidth before it gets to truly problematic and excessive levels of alcohol use. And the two driving questions are, what do adolescents get from engaging in that behavior, and what do they think that they get from engaging in those behaviors? And of course, the answers to those two questions are not always very well aligned. So I'm going to start off by talking about the risk and rewards of adolescent drinking. I'll start off with the bad side. You know, alcohol use, even in moderate forms for teenagers, is very unhealthy. It leads to a host of health problems, including weight gain, which I bring out because that's something that adolescents really care about. It also significantly raises the odds of accidents, and that's a that's a major reason why the number one cause of mortality among adolescents is accidents. And it also triggers or engenders or exacerbates psychological problems during a particularly vulnerable developmental time. And of course, it is a gateway into addiction and alcohol abuse and misuse. So it's bad. But to adolescents, there is a good side to it, and we have to talk about that good side. We can't ignore it. So it feels good, at least in the moment. But even more than that, adolescents tend to view alcohol use as a way of connecting with other people and participating in the social lives of their schools. Right? And so to understand that, you really have to go back to the truism of adolescent development, which is that the key developmental task of adolescence, which is individuating from your parents and establishing your own identity, converges with the differential pace of development and maturation of different parts of the brain to make susceptibility to peer influences greater during adolescence than at any other stage in the life course. So if we think about adults and why adults drink and how they might view it as a method of social integration, well, that tendency is amped up to about 11 among adolescents. And so that leads to what I call the sliding scale of adolescent drinking. That drinking is bad for teenagers, mostly really bad for teenagers, so we don't want them to drink. But if drinking leads to social integration, and social integration is very good for adolescents, do we want them to drink? And this leads to a question about how much of the risk are you willing to accept to gain the rewards and vice versa. And the important thing to know about that question is that adults tend to answer it very differently than adolescents do. So for example, I can start off by telling you about a study that I conducted really early in my career, and it's based on survey data and transcript data from about 20,000 teenagers in 100-something schools, about 130 schools. And we tracked them over a 2-year period. And what we saw is that drinking in 1 year is related to escalating depressive symptoms and declining academic achievement over that 2-year period, right? So drinking is getting them into trouble. And that's the general association on the population level. But that general association varies considerably across different schools. So in schools where drinking is uncommon and low status, has low social status, these effects are really strong. But in schools where it's popular activity and it's related to high status social groups, these effects actually get weaker. So they don't go away, but they do get weaker. And so it suggests that, the risk of adolescent drinking are very real, but to some extent the degree to which they are real and severe depends on the social situation that adolescents are embedded in. So I'm not saying that drinking is a good thing. I'm just saying that to curb adolescent drinking, we have to think like adolescents and think about what they think that they're gaining from drinking. So as another example, I can talk about a long-term project that I did about adolescents who don't fit in their schools. So some people who are just kind of on the margins, but also people who are outright rejected in their schools. And I wrote about this in this book, Fitting In, Standing Out. Now there's a national level component to this study using the same data that I just described. And what it shows is that adolescents who feel like they don't fit in their schools have substantially lower odds of attending college after they leave high school. And this is true when you're comparing people of the same race, social class, academic preparation, and their positions in their actual social networks, right? It's these feelings are triggering something. And there are a lot of mechanisms about why that is, and one of them has to do with drinking. And that is that when you have feelings of not fitting in, you're more likely to drink. And the more you drink, the less likely you are to gain some of those academic credentials and engage in those academic activities that you need to be able to go to college. So to dig into those mechanisms, I spent a year in high school, right? A big, diverse urban high school here in Texas, about 2,500 students. I did all sorts of things with the students in that school. One of the things that I did was I gave them cameras and all of these supplies, and I said, make me a collage that answers the question, who are you, right? Or who am I guess is what I should say. And doing this allowed me to talk to adolescents about a range of things, including drinking, and it really opened my eyes to something. So when I was dealing with the quantitative data on a national level, I had this assumption that the association between social problems and drinking was self-medication, that adolescents were in pain, they were having social problems, so they were in pain, and they were using alcohol to cope with that pain or numb that pain. But the qualitative data in this school actually showed me something different, which is that adolescents were using this as a strategy. They were using it as a way to make friends and to be a part of things in their school. And so it still has all this host of negative things associated with it and risks associated with it. But it is a strategy that they're using that's showing their own agency or their tendency or their drive to try and exert control over their lives, which they often feel is somewhat chaotic. So they're trying to do something. Now again, that's not saying that drinking is a good thing, but it is saying that they are perceiving it as a way of gaining advantages in their lives that they don't already have, or helping themselves in ways that they need help. So having said that, I've kind of made this case that alcohol is often perceived by adolescents as a way of gaining something for themselves and as a way of integrating into their social world, which is really important. It's an important part of adolescent development. Not the drinking, the social integration part. And the social integration is just a tool. The drinking is just a tool for that end. But having said that, I'm now going to poke a hole in that strategy and use some of my other research to show why it's maybe not the best strategy at all to achieve that end. Oops, I skipped all over that, sorry. Okay, so this is network research that I'm going to talk about. So in about 100-something schools, we were able to map out the social networks of each school, which means that you figure out each social tie among all the thousands of students in the school, and then you identify every social tie in the school and how they come together, and then how they change over time. So over time you can track how the network as a whole changes, or how your position in the network changes. And that tells us some important things, which is this. Drinking does seem to facilitate friendship formation in high school, right? That kids who drink make more friends over time, and even more important than making more friends, they make more friends of friends, right? That's where the real expansion of their social world is happening. So drinking is expanding their social world. Here's the rub for that. that those friendships that are created through drinking and friends of friendships that are created through drinking are much more unstable and much more transitory than friendships that are created in other ways and through other activities. Which means that they might look at this as a method of social integration, but it is a highly superficial social integration. So we can both be right at the same time and still be concerned about it. Okay, so I'm a basic researcher. I don't design or evaluate interventions, but what I do does have something to say towards that world. And so I'm going to end with 3 ideas about how to translate this research into practice and policy. The first one, I borrowed this term from Lori, adaptation with fidelity. And it has to do with the fact that many, if not most, interventions targeting adolescent alcohol use are school-based. But schools, as I've shown, vary quite widely in their drinking cultures. And so we really need to understand, before we implement an intervention, even at a supposedly effective one, what the norms and values surrounding drinking are in that school. Because that is going to be how we identify what is working with us or against us in any given school. So we have to be true to the very spirit of the intervention, but we have to embed it and tailor it to specific school cultures. The second thing is that social scientists know how we have very conventional tools for mapping the social structures of the school. So understanding those norms and values and all of those social connections. And social scientists can then be very good partners with people designing interventions, because we can tell you who you need to get on your side in that school and who needs to be endorsed, who you need to endorse your intervention in that school, and also who you need to avoid bringing in to that situation, especially given that there's a big focus on interventions on peer mentoring and peer delivery. But you know what? There's good peers for doing that and bad peers for doing that, and we need to figure out who they are. And then the last thing is, we tend to have a big focus on reducing drinking directly, but we can also reduce it indirectly. And by understanding what adolescents are gaining, or what they think they're gaining from drinking, we can think about fostering other opportunities for them to gain those rewards, absent the drinking part, in more healthy ways. So just as one example, if we're talking about adolescents who have a desire to connect with other people, feel a sense of accomplishment, there's really no better way to do that than through extracurricular activities. But of course, we're living in an age where extracurriculum is being cut in half or 90% or whatever statistic that we want to use for that. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot for a reason, which is about boosting academic achievement, but we're also maybe opening the door for other more negative behaviors to arise. So I'm just going to end by saying that I always have to say this when I talk to groups. A lot of what I study with drinking is really about how adolescents think that they're gaining something from drinking. But that doesn't mean that I'm saying that drinking is a good thing. I'm just saying that we need to understand what those perceived gains are in order to reduce drinking, right? We have to get inside the adolescent mind, which is always, a tricky thing to do, but one that's usually quite effective in the end. So thank you.
Thank you.